It's 9 a.m. and I call this meeting to order. Welcome to all who are joining us for the special call meeting of the State Board of Education. Casey Griffin on our staff will call the roll to establish a quorum.
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell.
Here.
Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Ferguson.
Here.
Mr. Hamby.
Here.
Mr. Jensen. Mr. Jensen.
Here.
Ms. Kim. Dr. House.
Here.
Mr. Morrow.
Here.
Madam Chairman.
Here.
Madam Chairman, I count 9 members present.
Daryl Cobbins is here.
Okay.
Welcome, Daryl. We have a quorum and are duly convened. Without objection, Elisa Kim is excused from attendance at this meeting. Before we move into the agenda, I do want to turn to Dr. Sarah Morrison, the Executive Director of the State Board of Education, to provide opening remarks. Dr. Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board and staff and others joining us today. Thank you on this beautiful April morning. It's good to be together. It strikes me that we are coming into, I think, a hopeful period at the end of this pandemic. I hope that we are feeling hopeful, but we still have a lot of work ahead of us. And I think you'll see members of the public joining our meeting today that there are a number of important items up before our board today related to recovery efforts and plans for the next school year. And I know our education community has been deeply engaged with members of our team, with the board, about various items up today, particularly how we think about virtual learning moving forward. How do we ensure that this summer, the time spent in summer camps and doing additional learning with our students sets them up for as much success as possible moving into next school year. But there are a number of efforts ongoing that have been very important to have engagement and conversation with our educators across the state, with our partners in this work. And I think you'll see the fruits of those conversations in today's items. But it is still just the beginning of our recovery efforts. And I know we'll be coming back together as a board later in May for our quarterly meeting, where there will be other items up that will continue to address some of the learning loss and the efforts to ensure that we're back up and running for next school year and doing everything possible to ensure students are ready for the work ahead. I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Madam Chair, but look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. At this time, I believe Commissioner Schwinn has not been able to join us yet. Charlie or Jack, can someone, there she is. I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner Schwinn, for the update on ESSER. We look forward to hearing all the things that are going on with the federal funding that's coming from the federal government. So thank you. Turning it over to you.
Absolutely. So obviously lots happening in terms of federal funding. And so I will go through the 3 different buckets of funding that have become available for schools and then a little bit looking into the future. So as a recap, last late spring, summer, we had what we call ESSER 1.0, and that was just about $260 million that came into the state. Those plans were all approved throughout the summer, and districts have access to those funds. There were no restrictions really on those funds as long as it was COVID related usage. 90% went to LEAs and 10% is state set aside for student and district services. Then in late December, the Congress passed and the president signed what we call ESSER 2.0. We received that funding in the beginning of January. And that was just about $1.1 billion for K-12 public schools in the state. This had some additional requirements on it. There is a much higher reporting threshold. We are still waiting for the federal government to give us any level of guidance on what those thresholds and requirements might be. But the money, 90% still goes to our K-12s, and then 10% again is the set aside for the state. We're allowed to keep 0.5% for the SEA. The other 9.5% ends up going out for grants and supports for districts. So those plans were all due by April 15th. We are just finishing getting final approvals. I think one of the challenges has been just frankly that the money is supposed to be spent towards supporting districts and schools for recovery efforts and acceleration efforts. So lots of conversation about, facilities and sporting spaces and things like that. Very clearly, sporting facilities and things like that are not part of the intent of the funds. It is about trying to move the needle forward for kids and getting kids back in school. And so before we had even finished, and most states had even finished collecting the plans, Congress passed a third wave, another stimulus, and that was just about $2.4 billion. And that we have received a strong portion of that. We will get the balance of that in the next month or so. Again, districts will be able to start planning now. Those plans will be due June 1st. Again, it's the same threshold of 90% goes to LEAs, 10% for the same set aside. The thing that's different about what we're calling ESSER 3.0 is that districts are required to spend 20% of their allocation on learning loss activities. That, from the state's perspective, that is on direct services to students. So not all of the ancillary things that might come with that, but a direct service to a child to maximize, I think, the intent of those funds. The SEA does not have those same requirements. We have to spend 1% of our funds on summer school, 1% on after school activities. We will be supporting additional learning loss activities with that fund to match at minimum what is being required from our LEAs. And so in total, if you take all of those, plus you add our coronavirus relief fund, the governor was very generous in adding tens of millions of dollars from the coronavirus relief fund. The governor's also very generous in giving all of his discretionary gear money towards K-12, and then some additional grants that the department's received. The state of Tennessee stands to receive $4.5 billion in federal relief funding for our K-12 schools. So an incredible opportunity. Those funds expire. So ESSER 1 expires in 22, ESSER 2 in 23, and ESSER 3 in 24. And so it is a relatively fast timeline in terms of spending that amount. As a reminder to the board, it's a ton of money, of course. We are also a reimbursement state. And so districts spend the funds, submit the documentation, and then we reimburse them for those expenditures. So we are going to continue to experience, I think, a lot of kind of rapidity in the system and a lot of sense of urgency on our end to be able to reimburse districts as quickly as possible, because most of our districts don't have, what ends up being $4.5 billion in reserves sitting around. So that's going to be the work of the department. The last thing I'll say is just in terms of public transparency and reporting, that's going to continue to be a priority. We have our public spending plans, which is E-Plan, but we will also be having more publicly facing plans that are the programmatic side. So that way, whether you are an elected official, a public official, a community member, a parent, et cetera, you're able to see what's happening with the funds. And the governor's going to be making some announcements and have some comments on expectations around that later today. But to be clear, LEAs have complete discretion, have complete discretion over how they spend their funds. It is a real moment in time and a real opportunity for the state to invest very wisely in students. The department will be putting out guidance in the next 2 weeks, in addition to what we've already put out to help with the massive planning. And then the only other thing that I would add is that there's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure package that has been proposed by the president. We do expect schools to stay in that infrastructure package, whether that is 50 billion or 100 billion. That seems to be part of the conversation. Right now, it looks like 50 billion would go towards states directly, and then another 50 billion would be at the federal level to disperse in terms of that grant making process. And so yet another round of stimulus funds, no shortage of funding, and I think a real opportunity for us to invest wisely and cohesively that will move the needle forward for kids.
So there certainly is a lot of funding, and I know that you have been tracking the usage of those funds or the drawdown of those funds in the past, in particular with 1.0. And it's my understanding you'll continue to do that, and I know you're working diligently with your team to encourage all the districts to get their plans in and to use the funds accordingly. And I know there are still some challenges, as you mentioned, with the guidance coming from the federal government. And so I would imagine that they're still drawing down on the first 1.0 and 2.0 was just, I think you said you just completed the application process there. So obviously there's a ton of work that's occurring in the field as well as in the department ensure that these funds are not left on the table. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, Commissioner, or if anyone else has any questions or comments.
I will just say to your point that yes, so the department will be posting regularly the spend downs, or at least requests drawdowns from districts. Remember that, and I will reinforce this, that whatever that percent is, it doesn't mean what the district has spent. It's what we know the district has spent because they've asked for a reimbursement for it. And so we'll be posting that regularly. In the state right now, we have everything from 1% that has been requested to 100%. So a pretty significant range. With ESSER 2 and 3, the reporting requirements are very high. And so we will be doing that on a monthly basis. So the requirement will be that all of those requests must be submitted monthly. We will report on that publicly monthly. We are requesting that districts use 1% of their allocations for that level of administrative support and set aside for monitoring, data collection, and reporting, because it is going to be substantial. We can't just put that on existing staff. I don't think the capacity is there. So know that you will be seeing that monthly report up from the department, and that will start in the new fiscal year.
Madam Chair,
Yes. Yes, Mr.
a
Benson.
question for Commissioner Swin. You just hit on a question that strikes me in a district. Can we support them? Can they hire somebody? I mean, that's administrating that kind of money is a huge task. Within the funding, can they hire somebody to help with that on it looks like a 2 or 3 year basis? And then a follow-up question, does this money go to charter schools, private schools? What's the limitation on who can actually receive the funds?
So great questions. So for the monitoring, auditing, and reporting side, yes, they can absolutely use their federal set-asides to hire or contract or whatever they might want to do. The department will be doing the same. We have enough staff to manage our existing funds, but not 4.5 billion. If you think about prior big federal stimulus packages, this is just beyond. So what we do recognize is that not all of our communities have access to people within their counties or within their districts who can do this work. So the department is in the process of putting out a procurement that then districts would be able to purchase off of, because it would be a state procurement, and that would allow them, so if they couldn't find someone in their community to do this level of work, they would at least have easy access to some contracting support to try to give, especially our small and rural districts, some options, given that everyone's going to be looking for this kind of talent, because it's not just education that got the relief funding. So appreciate you underscoring that. I think that's really important for us. The comptroller has also come out and been very clear about his expectations related to the tightness of the auditing procedures that will be in place, and then certainly the reporting. So we are continuing to push that narrative with districts about you've got to get that really, really tight. On the private school and charter side, two different answers there. So for charter schools, because in our state, they are not their own LEAs, they are part of the district. The local district is able to have complete discretion over their funds. So the local district will determine any allocations that would go directly to charter schools. I think we saw, frankly, in ESSER 1.0 that districts allocated different amounts per pupil to different schools. They have their own rationale for that. They're also able to determine what size of the pot go directly to charters. There is nothing that the state can do about that. That is 100% written into the federal law. And we've asked a number of different attorneys because we've gotten this question from quite a few folks. And so what we do expect is that districts, and I think we saw this in ESSER 1.0, but we do expect that in ESSER 2.0 and 3.0, that districts are very clear about how much should be going, that there is some general understanding of what a per pupil amount should be, and that charters get the appropriate share of those funds, because that is the intent of the law in terms of supporting all of our students. For private schools, it's a little bit different. ESSER 1.0 was, I'll just say it was a little bit of a disaster because it was going to be that there were 6 or 7 different ways in which it was supposed to go to private schools. Lots of states litigated over how they wanted it to be done. That all got resolved. And now for ESSER 2 and 3, what's happened is that the Congress has done a separate set aside just for private schools. And so they've actually articulated within the allocation, this is the amount that should go to private schools if private schools want to participate. And that way there's no kind of conflict between privates and the public sphere. We've seen a number of our private schools not want to participate in this relief funding, and the rationale has been either one, they're participating in a different federal program, so they can't participate in both, or the reporting burden is just too heavy for them, or they have philosophically do not want to have to be beholden to the federal government for any part of their program. And so we've seen a number of different responses there, but all of that's gone out for ESSER 2. We'll have the same process for ESSER 3.
One more question.
Yes.
Is the department looking at some overarching program that could be, or I heard you say it's up to the districts. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So districts have that 90% set aside, and they have complete discretion. So state legislatures can't legislate, they can't mandate. There is literally and very clearly written into the federal law, it is complete local control over those funds. Now, there's a lot of pressure and other things. We're seeing different states apply that pressure in different ways, but the districts get their 90% and they get to decide. Now, the state, of the 10% that's remaining, 9.5 or 95% of that amount is for the state to decide for state level activities. We will push the vast majority of that out through grants, typically matching grants, to help shepherd and steward towards a cohesive vision of how we think things can move forward. You saw that with Literacy and Reading 360, with our ESSER 1.0, a massive investment in literacy and reading. I think we will also be investing pretty heavily in tutoring supports and matching grants there. And then certainly in summer programs to get to the high school space, because we weren't, the learning loss bill that passed in January special session was that K through 8. We'll use our set aside to then supplement to support the high school space next summer and the summer after.
Thank you.
Of course.
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
Yes, for the commissioner, you had indicated that each one of these basically have a sunset on them at 2022, 2023, and that they have to be spent by that point in time. Do they have to be executed, reported on, and dispersed by that period of time?
Yes, sir. So right now it is fully, completely, and like all done. Money goes back October 1st.
Okay, so in the various districts understand that that means moving things up further ahead for them to be able to get all those activities done within the time period. The other concern I have is you said that we don't even know the reporting requirements yet for 2.0 for 2023. So that seems to, be part of the process. We got to get those reporting requirements so they know what they have to do, whether they're going to take the money or not. When do we expect to get those?
So that is a great question. We were on a call with the new secretary late last week, and he is hopeful that maybe we will get them at the end of April. And so we did not get a firm date. I think a lot of states were pushing. I will say assertively, there is some general frustration because we also know that, we're telling districts like there's a sense of urgency. You got to spend down this funding. And then on the back end, if they make rules and policies that are counter, it puts states in a really tough position. I think we've talked to our congressional delegation about it. They are actively working, so I'm very appreciative there. And they've been supportive of the tone and tenor that's we're going to do what's best for Tennessee. And then the federal government, if they're late on their end, if the secretary's late on his end, they're going to have to accommodate because we've got kids to serve. I think the other portion that you brought up around facilities, I appreciate you underscoring that and hope that we can all continue to do that. We are saying, if a building is, half done in terms of renovations and the money expires, you don't get to finish it. You'd have to use local funds. So really prioritizing all of our facilities work as early as possible. Even if the infrastructure money comes, it's not like we have all these additional construction companies and folks who can do the work. You can just move where you charge it to different places and maybe get another year extension. We are asking that all projects, programs, et cetera, are done at least 3 months before the money expires. And that way, if you have contracts that are done 3 months in advance, you know what's left over and you can spend down that into some more kind of smaller projects so that we don't revert any money. So we're giving that guidance to districts as well.
So just to put this in perspective, the annual budget for education in Tennessee is about $6 billion or something like that?
Yes, sir.
So in the next 3 years, we're getting not quite, but almost another year's expenditure So the districts really, how are they responding? Are they really working this like they should be?
Yeah, I think it's everyone's going through different phases and different times, but I think it's pretty overwhelming, and I think it's a shocking amount of money. It's like just wave after wave of money. And I will say respectfully to everybody else in the country, but this conversation about let's open up schools and that's what the money's for, Tennessee's done that. Like that's been all year. We've been working really hard. Even just or Arizona, their big debate right now is about making whole their version of the BEP. Our General Assembly fully funded our BEP formula as it stands right now. And we've added more money through the summer programming, et cetera. So we're in a really good place compared to what I'm seeing across the country. So this is all discretionary. And I think our districts are feeling a lot of the pressure on, we have things to make up gaps, but when we don't have to make up gaps, what do we do with all of this one-time funding? So we're going to be providing a lot of support and guidance and continue to do so in the next 3 weeks.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner, I have a question that when I even say it in my head, it sounds incredibly naive. But given the pressures, and I know most of us have spoken with school districts, they are overwhelmed and they do not want to leave any money on the table. There's no question about that. But there are real concerns with many of the projects that they want to go forward with. And it gets back to the construction issue. And so in conversations, either with the U.S. Secretary of Education or when the governor is on a call with other governors and the president, is there any conversation centered around giving any leeway, in particular with construction projects, and there's weather-related issues that occur that may delay a project through nobody's fault, especially the construction company. So are we even asking the question, what kind of wiggle room could there be when we get involved in a project, which I think would scare me as a director if I've got a project that's $1 million and I'm not going to get the funding. It could be more than $1 million, but I'm not going to get the funding from the local government. I've got to do it with the ESSER funds. So I'm going to stop and just gauge your response.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. We have been asking that, and we've asked that to, a number of our congressional delegation as a point. We've also talked to the Senate Help Committee and just asked, what is the likelihood that we'll see any wiggle room? Because typically they end up extending. What we've heard is, as of right now, they are not looking to provide additional time because they're saying this is relief funding, this is emergency funding. You either need it or you don't. We can pay back some of the debt that's incurred off of these funds. Now, when we get closer to the date, I don't know. They can always change their mind, but we're operating because we're not hearing any real wiggle room right now, and we are pushing on it. We are operating and being very clear with our districts that are saying, like, assume it's September 30th until you hear otherwise. Get your facilities projects in now. And that's all. Remember, you can't build new buildings. It has to be a lot of the, deferred maintenance, HVAC systems, ventilation, et cetera. The only other thing I would add there is that the department, and we've been clear with districts on this as well, the pressure is a little bit different on the SCA. And I will say that all of the states are pushing back very hard on this. But in the law, you get 1 year as a state department to spend your funds. You don't have to have them fully spent, but you have to have every single dollar encumbered, meaning the contract or the grant has been executed. And we all know state procurement processes, and they take 9 to 12 months for some of the bigger ones. If you are in a shorter or smaller procurement or grant, it can take 4 to 7. But it has put a lot of pressure on states because we have essentially 12 months from the date we receive the funds to have every dollar spoken for. So we're on a much faster timeline than our districts are. That's created, I think, a little bit of stress in the system also as districts are trying to align to the state and we're trying to move things fast, and all states are in a different place. So I think we're going to see a lot of this start to shake out over the next few months. Hopefully we get that direction from the feds. I know that the secretary, he's only a few weeks into the job. He's working really hard. He's feeling the pressure, and I'm hopeful that we will get that end of April guidance that we desperately need.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments with the commissioner?
Yes, ma'am. Harold Cobbins.
Yes, Mr. Cobbins.
2 questions. One sort of dovetails on the chairwoman's question about flexibility. And just wondering, I was just reading an article this morning about the the lack of supply of materials for construction throughout the country and the pressures that that's putting on one, pricing, but then also two, timelines. And so, I know it's not your decision, but to whatever extent that message could get back to those who have the ability to allow for flexibility and leeway, I think that's really important because, this, in addition to every other project across the nation, just puts more pressure on demand for those materials and supplies. Second thing is really a question about the federal funding. I know it's geared towards quote unquote projects, but knowing that for the past year, there's a social, emotional, and psychological toll that has been experienced by both students and educators. And so just wondering if there's any funding, whether through 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, or anything else, that provides for some support and assistance for particularly students and educators who've experienced some challenges over the past year.
Yes, sir. So two good questions. On the facility side, you are right, because it's not just education getting project funding, and we have a lot of the local grants that are coming out as well. Everyone's doing facilities work. I think the best argument to your point really is about saying if we can at least get a PO executed, even if there are some delays in shipping, just like we saw with computers and devices at the beginning of the year, that we can count that because it's no one's fault. We also, I think, and this is just candidly, I think we want to prevent some of the price wars that we're getting into when you have that limited supply and everybody wants it. We're jacking up prices, and that's not actually what we need to do with public dollars, and certainly not for schools. So I think all of those are things we're pushing on. For all of the social and mental health and other needs, yes, these dollars, all ESSER 1, 2, and 3 can be used for those services. It explicitly calls that out actually as a recommended expense. The department will be putting aside several $millions for mental health supports to go along with the governor's announcement on the mental health trust fund that he made a couple weeks ago. So I think a really significant investment in that space is going to be necessary. I will also add that outside of the ESSER dollars, there's $800 million nationally that will go towards homeless youth. Tennessee gets about 2% of that. And there was a massive increase in terms of IDEA, or funding to go towards children with disabilities. And all of those, I think, will be able to support mental health and social needs that are coming up as a result of the pandemic. So there's 5 buckets of money right now, potentially 6 with infrastructure. And we're excited that we'll be able to get kids all the supports they need that schools traditionally provide. Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Yes,
Someone-
Mr. Jensen?
Actually, it's 2. Career and technical education.
Mhm.
Where is the priority? Is that a statewide initiative? Is that going to be? This just seems like an incredible opportunity to push that along, and not just push, but really get to the place where we have a meaningful statewide initiative on career and technical. And I'm on my soapbox now, but if 50% of our kids are not going to go to college, which I think statistically is the case, this just seems like a stellar opportunity to look at that and dream about it and think about it. Obviously, we've got to do it in a hurry, but that it just seems to me to be something that's incumbent upon the department and this board to really think about. And the other piece of that, the other thing that I'm on my soapbox is the broadband issue and how we initiate. If we're leaving that, to the local districts, that may be fine, but that seems like a statewide issue that ought to be looked at. And again, we may be so limited by the way the law is written that we can't, but I just put those 2 things on the table as things that seem to me to be an opportunity that we might have to take years to get to, and we've got some funding that we can push it along pretty fast.
We agree. And I think our first step towards that is we put out an innovative high school grant that was $14 million. It will support significant number of schools, 20 to 40 schools eventually, that will be able to focus on CTE programs. So those are work-based learning, apprenticeships, dual credits, high school on a campus, or at an employer site. So I think we're really trying to have districts look at innovative ways to approach CTE programming, even in consortias, regional consortias, to build out a high school, to really kind of push that support there. We have been thrilled. We had, I think, over 120 folks on our introductory call, and representing, dozens and dozens of districts. So we might need to expand that to accommodate everybody, but we're excited about that investment. And I think, the second part of that on broadband, totally agree. The feds put a separate pot of money for expanding broadband and internet access nationally. So we have another block grant that came to the state related to that support. The department's going to continue to put those out. We've got some grants related to our tutoring program that will provide high-speed internet to families. And then we've got that great partnership with T-Mobile that over 5 years will be able to get high-speed internet at a very, very low cost and free for 200,000 families in the state. And so that partnership, I think, is going to be really helpful, especially for our lower income and rural families as they're looking to make sure they have access.
And then again, I'm sorry but what's the market communication plan around this? Because I don't know that I've seen a lot in either the Tennessean or the Commercial Appeal or Daily Memphian over here. Is there a communication plan that's being developed?
Yes, so we appreciate you saying that and would love to continue to spread the good word around ways that we can and should be spending the funding. We as a department talk to the superintendents twice a week and have some engagement groups. So we've been focusing really on districts and helping to facilitate the process of their planning and things like that. The governor is holding a press conference later this afternoon with some key members of the education committees to be able to talk through and try and continue to publicly state, here are expectations, here's the moment in time, here's the opportunity. And so really excited about that. Then we'll be doing kind of a state tour and have several smaller events throughout the state to continue to spread kind of the opportunity, the work, abilities for communities to partner with districts and what that can look like. And then certainly we'll continue to promote and support the resources that are being developed by the department. And those are ongoing. They are on our website. The special session website hosts quite a few of them. And then as we develop the ESSER recovery website, which will have all of the plans from districts, links to e-plan, and then our resources. And that should go up in the next couple of weeks as well. But the governor and the General Assembly will do a big kickoff today. They've done a lot of other more private meetings in the before that to make sure that they were giving enough warning around kind of what their messaging would be.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner. One thing I do want to add to what Mr. Jensen said, and I think at a future workshop, it would be ideal, in my opinion, because I think I know we've had conversations during board meetings in the past, not only about broadband, but about CTE. And I think we have varying degrees of understanding of how that works from a department perspective and also what's happening in the field. So I think that would be a great workshop presentation. I believe we are ready to move on. Last call for questions, comments.
Just one quick question. I didn't want to interrupt the discussion, but
Yes.
if I could, just first of all,
Please.
Commissioner, thank you for that update. As you can see, our board members are very interested, as is everyone, in understanding this enormous opportunity, but also I think your comments putting it in context in terms of why we're getting so much money at the state level when you think about what's happening in other states. I found that to be particularly helpful. My only question, I think you touched on this, but just to clarify a bit more about the reporting, because I think to your points, it's a lot of money in a short amount of time, and understanding how districts and learning from each other are going to be spending it. I think, there's going to be lots of people interested. Can you describe just a little bit more what that monthly reporting will look like, and how will districts in particular be able to understand sort of more in real time, sort of what their partner districts are using it for and how that might inform their thinking?
Yes, so I think part of the challenge right now is that we've got a whole bunch of mock-ups and kind of ready to go. We're waiting for the federal government to list their requirements, because we don't want to put something out, districts build a system around it, and then it has to change for the federal reporting. They will be requiring us to report to them, and so we have to require it from districts. I will say from the department's perspective, and based on some preliminary conversations with DC, we do expect that it will be, if you've spent money, that you need to request the reimbursement on a monthly basis for everything you've spent to date. So you will see the reporting on all of the drawdowns of funding for each of those buckets. You will likely see some data reporting in terms of drawdowns on specific allocation buckets. So what are we spending money on and what cadence. A little bit of the programmatic reporting related to outcomes for students aligned to those data points. And then we'll be requesting some very clear data fields to be submitted so that we can track and start to be able to have more program evaluations and research that links spending with outcomes, so that as we go on, we're not looking back in 4 years and saying, well, that's what happened. We really want to be able to have all of those decisions informed along the way. And so you'll see kind of that spending, you will see programmatic reporting, and then you'll also see a data reporting field for some of the, I think, more traditional data reports around student achievement, computers, attendance, things like that.
Great. Yeah, that seems super important. Thank you for that, just additional detail. And this board will be interested in updates as we move forward, I'm sure. So thank you for being with us today.
Of course.
Thank you. Moving into our agenda, the first item is the statement of necessity by Ms. Angie Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Angie Sanders, General Counsel for the State Board of Education. Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated Section 844-108B3, the State Board submits this determination of necessity for its special call board meeting held via WebEx at 9 a.m. on April 12, 2021. The board called this meeting to consider a number of time-sensitive issues, including emergency rules and evaluation policy revisions necessary for implementation of special session legislation, final reading of a permanent rule relating to continuous learning plans, as well as consideration of a textbook waiver request from Clinton City Schools. Due to the time-sensitive nature of many of these items, as well as restrictions on in-person gatherings related to COVID-19, it was determined that this meeting should be conducted electronically to ensure the board could carry out essential business in a safe, transparent way that avoids creating large gatherings of people. Notice of this meeting was posted on the State Board's website, along with the agenda and instructions for accessing the WebEx. And that is it. Madam Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Sanders. Moving into item 2, consent items, adoption of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
This is Mike Edwards, I move.
Bob
Mr.
Eby seconds.
Mr. Edwards provides the motion. Mr. Eby provides the second. Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell,
Aye.
Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards,
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Ms. Kim, Mr. Morrow.
Aye.
Madam Chairman?
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
The ayes have it, and the consent agenda is approved. Just a reminder, which I should have done before we did this motion, the typical reminder that all votes will be roll call, and members making the motion in a second, please state your name for the record, just to ensure there's no mix up there. I think we have this down to a science now. But at any rate, moving into action items on final reading. The first item is 3A, Educator Evaluation Policy 5.201. I believe that Mr. Jack Powers is going to present.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jack Powers with the Department of Education. This final read item revises the teacher and administrator evaluation policy. If you recall, this item was originally a cleanup item and was necessitated by the creation of a new teacher and administrator evaluation rule. And so we've been moving a lot of the requirements from this policy into rule. And so between first and final reading, there were several additional revisions. And this first one that you see here on the cover sheet is kind of a continuation of that cleanup effort. And what we did in effect was move a lot of the appendices into the actual body to just create new sections of the policy. The next 2 items, I'll just provide a little bit of context about, because these items are not cleanups. These are kind of additional language that has been added. So during the special session on education, the Tennessee General Assembly passed an accountability bill that ensured that teachers, students, schools, and districts would not be would be held harmless related to assessment data generated during this school year due to kind of the extraordinary events related to COVID. While that bill addressed a lot of the testing and accountability items, it did not touch on some of the things that are within the purview of state board rule or policy. And so what you see here are two revisions to ensure that additional accommodations can be made for educators due to some of the circumstances surrounding COVID-19. And I'll note before I kind of touch on these that these are two these are two accommodations that we have just kind of heard an abundance of feedback about from the field, educators asking and saying that this is necessary in addition to school leaders. So the first language that was added clarifies that educators who choose to nullify their 2020-2021 level of effectiveness scores may use their most recently available level of effectiveness score for the purposes of determining observation pacing for the 2021-2022 school year. The way that observation pacing works is it's based off the LOE score that you receive. And right now, the way the policy reads without this revisions is that if you do not have an LOE score, then you receive the maximum number of observations, which I believe is 3. And so what this allows is just for a little bit more flexibility for an educator who nullifies their score to have their observation pacing be based on the prior score. So the point number 3 on here, the last kind of language that was added clarifies that educators who receive an LOE score for this school year receive the maximum number of professional development points, regardless of the LOE score they received or whether they chose to nullify their LOE score. We're making this recommendation in recognition of the immense challenges posed by this school year for students and teachers. Whether teachers have learned to teach in an entirely remote environment, in person, in the face of a pandemic, or many of our teachers have toggled kind of between the two, teaching in person and remotely. Educators have no doubt learned new skills and adjusted instructional practices to continue serving Tennessee students. This recommendation that educators who taught last year receive the maximum number of PDPs, again, is just in recognition of the immense, I think, professional growth that a lot of educators have seen and kind of their perseverance in the face of challenges. And we believe that this is kind of a fair way to address professional development points in the face of a global pandemic. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll take any questions that board members have on the item.
Are there any questions or comments?
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby?
I think Mr. Powers may have answered the question I have, but it has to do with that statement that says educators who choose to nullify their LOE scores for 2020, 2021 may use their most recently available LOE score for the purpose of determining their observation pacing. And my question is why is that may and not shall? I mean, what other options do they have? I guess they have the option that they could choose to take the maximum number of observations if they wanted to.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know that many educators, if they nullified, would choose to do that.
No, that's my question. Is that as I read through this thing, it just seemed like to me that you know it should be shall, unless there's a situation where educators, and all the educators I know wouldn't be out looking for more and more observations. So.
Sure. And, you know, one thing I'll note, I want to make sure to note this, you know, observations are not meant to be harmful at all. They're meant to be kind of an opportunity for growth, especially with our early career teachers. So I think that's an important point to make. With that being said, I can't think of a scenario where they wouldn't choose to do that. And so I think one of the things that I'll note is when we were crafting this language, we tried to align it with a lot of the language that was in that accountability legislation that passed during special session, and that may terminology is I think carried over from that. If you're kind of looking for where it came from, I think verbatim. With that being said, you know, of course, may and shall. I think that considering all educators would do it, I don't know if changing the word would actually make a practical difference. But But I will leave that up to maybe the general counsel that I know is on the call.
Jack, this is Angie Sanders. Since you pinged me, the only question I have about that is, would changing may to shall somehow impact an educator who doesn't have a LOE score, a most recently available LOE score?
That's a good question. I mean, it is important to note here that for our early career teachers, for example, a teacher who's in their second year of teaching this year would not have a most recently available score to reflect back to. So again, I would leave it to kind of the legal counsel to determine if may or shall is better, but that is a good point that if it said shall, there wouldn't actually be certain educators who could fall into that shall category because they wouldn't have a score due to the school closures and disruptions from last school year.
And then in that case, Jack, they would default to the maximum number of observations, which would then be 3.
That's correct.
So, Bob, I think probably in order to avoid confusion, we maybe leave it as may to account for that situation where an early career educator might not have a most recently available LOE score.
I agree, Angie. Thank you. And thank you, Jack, because there might, like you say, the observations are not meant to be punitive. They're meant to be informative. And there may be some teachers who would like to have it. And by changing it to shall, you wouldn't give them that option. So you've answered my question and I'll leave it as it is. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Jack, I have a question on the red line version on page 5. Number 5, approved achievement measures, number 2 under that. It says teachers assigned to schools may select the appropriate school-wide score for the school at which they spend the majority of their time. It's a similar concept here. So what could they choose to go with the score that's from the school they spend the least amount of time? So again, they have the option to choose, and if they don't choose, would there be a default? That's the second part of the question.
Great question, Madam Chair. My understanding is that they could, that first scenario you pose, they could choose to use the measure from the school they spent the least amount of time in. And I believe that language is just carried over from what was prior in an appendices. So, but that is correct. They can choose if they wanted to, which school to take the achievement measure from.
Okay. And then number 5 under that same approved achievement measures, it says for any of the shelf measures used for pre-K, the district should at least measure the standards that are aligned to TN ELDS. It is suggested that standards in each math cluster and all ELA standards be measured. So the word suggested, so there's no requirement. This is something that we're saying with an off-the-shelf product. It's up to the district. Is that correct?
That's correct. It is the district's choice on kind of how to use that assessment to most appropriately assess students.
Okay, that's all from me. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve item 3A?
Madam Chair, it's Gordon Ferguson. I'll move for approval.
Mr. Ferguson provides the motion. Is there a second?
Nate Morrow, second.
Mr. Morrow provides the second. Any further discussion? Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell,
Aye.
Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards,
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Ms. Kim, Mr. Morrow. Mr.
Aye.
Morrow.
Aye.
Madam Chairman.
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Thank you. The ayes have it and the motion is approved. Thank you, Mr. Powers, as always. Moving on to item 3B, continuous learning plans. Ms. Amy Owen and Ms. Angie Sanders.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research for the State Board. I'll begin presenting this item. This is a permanent rule for continuous learning plans. As you all remember, last June, the state board established through emergency rule an expectation that LEAs in public charter schools develop continuous learning plans for the purpose of addressing COVID-19 related school closures. Those plans have been in effect for this school year, and the emergency rule about these plans expires next month. However, we want to make sure that districts and charters have a basis of planning in place for any future states of emergency. So this permanent rule establishes a process for maintaining and activating CLPs moving forward. Many of the requirements are the same as what was in the emergency rule, with a few revised specifications to ensure effective attendance procedures and instruction by licensed Tennessee educators. Without establishing this process in permanent rule, and with the emergency rule expiring next month, CLPs would simply cease to exist if the board did not move forward on a permanent rule. We know that unfortunately emergencies and disasters do happen, and we want to be sure that there's an instructional plan in place in those scenarios. I want to emphasize that districts and charter schools are not required to resubmit or redevelop their CLPs until there is a state of emergency that affects their operations. And that's because we want to minimize additional paperwork this summer, given that many districts are making plans around literacy, summer programming, and starting school next year. While there is currently a state of emergency in effect, districts and charter schools should be making plans for next year with the understanding that when that state of emergency is lifted, CLP implementation will no longer be an option. It's only an option if there's a state of emergency in effect that affects district and school operations. Students who want full-time virtual education will therefore need to enroll in virtual schools. And I know the department has provided guidance about how to establish virtual schools for LEAs that don't already have one, and for parameters for virtual schools in general. They have some recent FAQs out. I'll also mention that we're looking for ways to incorporate technological innovations moving forward, as we've all learned lessons about effective practices this school year, and we don't want to lose those. We want to make sure that we capture best practices in terms of virtual education and can establish strong guidelines for those moving forward. The state board held a rulemaking hearing on March 25th to seek public input about this item. While no comments were offered at the rulemaking hearing, we did receive stakeholder feedback from directors of schools at a conference of the Tennessee Organization of School Superintendents, as well as through emails, the Department of Education, and the governor's office as part of our stakeholder engagement relating to this rule. At this time, I'd like to read into the record a statement that the governor's office released this morning about this item. The statement reads, "In-person learning is safe, and it's the only way our students will get back on track after significant learning loss. I support the State Board of Education's work to ensure that in-person learning is again the standard in Tennessee, and virtual learning is reserved for emergency use only." Again, that's a statement from Governor Lee's office just this morning about this item. With all that said, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Are there questions?
Madam Chair, this is Nick Darnell.
Yes, Mr. Darnell.
Amy, a question that I received last week about the virtual learning, and I know that you stated, if a student wanted to enroll in a virtual school, that would need to be a separate school. Is there any flexibility for school systems to continue, the dual instruction like many of us have had to do this year, where a student could stay in a certain classroom and let's say 90%, 95% of the students are actually in person, but then you may have a student for whatever reason joins virtually through Google Meet or Zoom or something like that. Is there any flexibility in this?
There is not. If the state of emergency remains in effect, whether that's due to COVID or any other state of emergency, districts could implement their CLPs, which may be written that way. If there is not the state of emergency, then the option for a student who wants to attend 100% virtually is to go through a virtual school. There is flexibility, and I understand there'll be potentially some guidance forthcoming about short-term scenarios where a student may need to quarantine for 10 days or 2 weeks, where they could potentially access instruction virtually. But if there's a decision that we want to be virtual for the entire school year, that would not be permissible under this rule.
Are there other questions or comments? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve item 3B, continuous learning plans?
Bob Eby moves for approval.
Mr. Eby provides the motion. Is there a second?
Nate Morrow, second.
Mr. Morrow provides the second. Any further discussion? Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell,
Aye.
Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards,
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Ms. Kim, Mr. Morrow.
Aye.
Madam Chairman?
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is approved. Thank you, Ms. Owen. Moving to item 3C, summer learning plans, Mr. Jack Powers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jack Powers with the Department of Education. Pursuant to Public Chapter 1 of 2021, the State Board of Education was authorized to promulgate emergency rules to implement the Tennessee Learning Loss, Remediation, and Student Acceleration Act. And in the act, it was required of the Department of Education to establish an innovative benchmark assessment pilot program, including state-adopted benchmark assessments, to allow teachers to more frequently measure student learning and to address student learning loss. According to the Act, state-adopted benchmark assessments may be used to determine student priority status for after-school learning mini-camps, learning loss bridge camps, and summer learning camps. Additionally, state-adopted benchmark assessments may serve as an in-person pre-test and post-test after camps to measure student progress. This emergency rule establishes that for this summer only, LEAs may request from the Commissioner of Education permission to use locally adopted benchmark assessments for the purposes of identifying priority students for all 3 different types of camps. And again, that is for the summer of 2021 only. Additionally, locally adopted benchmark assessments may be used as that pre and post test to measure student progress during the summer of 2021 only. Additionally, this emergency rule clarifies that college degree, as it relates to the staffing requirements for the summer learning camps, means a bachelor's degree. And with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to take any questions that board members may have on the item.
Are there any questions?
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Mr. Eby?
Yeah, I had a question. And under 2B, it says states may hire a person with a college degree who has successfully completed a learning loss, remediation, and student acceleration program preparation course. So is that preparation course just a course on how to teach, or does it include assurance that content knowledge is also held by the potential instructor? In other words, how are we assured that the instructors that are hired have the content knowledge? I know many cases in the past where gym teachers were teaching chemistry, et cetera, like that. How do we assure that?
That's a good question, Mr. Eby. And you know what I'll say is, as far as whether there would be an assessment at the end of the training, I don't believe that there is one planned at this time. As you know, the implementation of this particular special session item starts, this summer. But I will say that, I think the idea here is that if a licensed teacher cannot be found, nor can there be found a candidate that is at a teacher preparation program, in that subject area of study, that the belief is that, kind of in that third tier, if we're kind of looking at trying to staff camps with qualified individuals, that someone who holds a 4-year bachelor's degree and goes through the training is kind of that is also an acceptable option. What I'll say, subject area wise, math and English are called out specifically in the bill. I do believe that training would focus on those subject areas specifically, just because if you look at the majority of the actual hourly requirements, it does have to be devoted to those core subject areas.
So you believe, or and I guess again, I'm concerned that we're providing I don't know, it's an opportunity, but an avenue where the students aren't going to get the quality of education because they're not going to have a teacher that has the content knowledge. I just would like to understand how we know that they've got the content knowledge to teach it.
Sure. And what I'll say, Mr. Eby, is that we're still in development on I think the training. So I'd be happy to share more concrete details with you as everything is kind of buttoned up there. But I will highlight again that, you know, districts have to kind of go through that hierarchy. They have to first find or look to find a licensed and properly endorsed teacher in that subject area. And then second, they have to look and see if there's a teacher, a candidate at a teacher preparation program, ideally one that is studying that in one of those content areas to get one of those endorsements. So they have to do those two things before looking to potentially staff the camps with that bachelor degreed individual that completes the training.
If we can't require them to have a bachelor's degree in a related field or something, and I don't know whether we can or not, can we at least put language in here that says that the districts are strongly encouraged to utilize people who have who meet those requirements, but also have demonstrated content knowledge? Something like that. Again, I mean, I'd like to say we're requiring that, but I understand this is an unusual year and getting people this late at date, but at least go on record that we want people to have the content knowledge or demonstrated content knowledge.
Sure. You know, this is definitely an area that I will highlight that while this law was working its way through special session was something that legislators also highlighted as being an area of concern. And there was an amendment that actually kind of further solidified that kind of tiered approach where they have to kind of first look to find the licensed and endorsed teacher, second teacher prep candidate, third the bachelor degreed individual. I do not believe that we can require that content knowledge based on the parameters of what is in the law. But I would defer to the general counsel on the call in terms of, I think putting language in that's strongly encouraged might be okay. I don't know about the requiring language just based on what the actual letter of the law says.
Bob, this is Angie Sanders, General Counsel. I would agree with Jack's assessment that I think specifying that it had to be someone with a college degree in that specific content area is a little bit beyond our authority in terms of the way the law is written. We could include some sort of encouraging language. I'll also point out that I know the department has issued quite a bit of guidance for districts on these programs already. And so I don't know if that's a place more for guidance where the department could clarify that and strongly encourage that they try to find folks with a college degree in that content area. But if you felt strongly enough that you wanted to include that encouraging language in this rule, we would need an amendment to do that. But I think encouraging is about as far as we could go.
I guess I would like to go on record and I would make a motion that we add the language that the districts are strongly encouraged to assure content knowledge by finding people who have demonstrated knowledge in the courses that they will be teaching. That opens it up. It doesn't say you don't have to have the degree in that field, but at least some kind of demonstrated knowledge, maybe in their work profession or something like that in the field that they'll be teaching. I'd make that as a motion.
For clarification, Mr. Eby, where are you suggesting that be inserted? Under the first paragraph of 2?
To be a person with a college degree who has successfully completed learning loss. College degree is defined as degree, bachelor's degree. Then say it is strongly encouraged that districts hire personnel who have demonstrated content knowledge in the courses that they will be teaching.
Sanders, you captured all of that. So we have I see our writing. We have a motion by Mr. Eby for an amendment to this rule. Do we have a second?
This is Mike Edwards. I'd like to make a second, but I also like to say something too, if I may. You know, this is an emergency meeting. I mean, we're talking about stuff that as a result of COVID over the last year, but so much, it's not so much how do we need to bend the rules, because we tend to forget that this whole thing's about recovery, that we've had so much learning loss that we're going to have to do extraordinary things to try to catch it up. And in doing so, we're being asked to do something that we have railed against for the last forever. And that is allowing teachers in a classroom in front of students who are supposedly behind and needing to be caught up, that could possibly not have a command and a competency in the content that we're asking them to teach, and those kids very much need to receive. So I agree with Bob that we need to strongly recommend it, but the truth of the matter is, and this is a question, I guess, for Angie, what are we being asked to do? This is a law. Is it within their discretion? And if it's not, what is our law doing? I mean, what is our vote doing?
That's a great question, Mike. Again, this is Angie Sanders, General Counsel for the board. The reason that we have brought, or the department has brought this rule, is because the additional language that is being added by the board, that is on top of the legislation that passed, is the provision that a college degree is defined as a bachelor's degree. So the board has the ability by law, when we promulgate rules, as long as we have rulemaking authority, which we do under this law, to further define certain terms. And so we are defining college degree as a bachelor's degree here, and that is why this rule is before you all.
So we're defining, we do have the latitude to define it as a bachelor's degree. We can't go further and define it as a degree in that content.
I think trying to define it as a degree in that specific content area may be going potentially beyond what was intended legislatively. I just don't know that we know clear legislative intent in terms of wanting to limit that pool even further.
So I don't want to beat. So what I'm wanting to do is figure out if I can vote yes for this. So tell me exactly one more time what it is that I'm agreeing, that I'm in favor of, without getting beyond. It's what I'm in favor of is I've got a bill that's been brought to us, and I'm voting to require it to be a bachelor's degree, and that's it. I'm not saying anything as to whether I think the law is wise or we anticipate it to be effective. It's that, do I agree that it should be stated to be a bachelor's degree?
That's correct. That is what you all are adding in terms of this rule.
And we've added Mr. Eby's amendment to strongly encourage to be in the content area.
That's correct.
Okay,
If you approve that amendment.
I got it.
So at least we are, I agree with what Mr. Edwards says, his whole thought process. But at least what we're doing is we are allowing districts to get through this year, this summer only, to use college degree people to help recover their learning loss. And we are going on record that says that we believe that those college degree people should be competent by demonstrated within the courses that they teach. I think that's what I think that's what we're doing right now, right?
This is Angie Sanders. Yes, Chairman Eby, that is correct. Now, in a minute, the next item speaks more generally to teacher licensure moving forward, and so we can talk a little bit more about that. But this rule is specific to these summer learning programs that will be occurring this summer.
This is Sarah. I'm not sure if the commissioner is still with us, but one thing I would add too is just clarifying, like you did, Bob, that this is for the summer camps. We're not talking about sort of regular 3-year instruction next school year. This is just for the summer camps. As you said, Mike, to make sure that we're catching students up as much and as quickly as possible. And I do think one of the reasons the department and the law that passed as it did didn't require a certified teacher initially is that we all know our educators are tired. I think there was some fear initially that they wouldn't be able to staff with our regular educators over the course of the summer in every case. But I have heard Penny say on more recent occasions that they're hearing from districts that they actually have a lot of their teachers agreeing to come and teach these summer camps. So I'm not sure if it's going to be as much of a concern as maybe initially people thought going into the summer in terms of certified educators, but that's just some additional context in terms of how things are shaping up, it seems.
She just chatted. That is correct, I think.
She did.
Yes, I didn't want to jump in, but yes, this is Penny. That is what we are hearing. There was more concern at the start. We're hearing a lot of districts who have said they're seeing a lot more uptick, and so this would just be for the summer programming and just in the cases where we do have some districts that are struggling for additional support.
Do we have any other discussion on the amendment before we move into the vote? So we have a motion by Mr. Eby and we have a second by Mr. Edwards. Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll for the approval of the amendment to this summer learning program?
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Mr. Darnell.
Aye.
Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson.
Aye.
Mr. Hamby.
Aye.
Mr. Jensen. Mr. Jensen. Ms. Kim. Mr. Morrow.
Aye.
Madam Chairman.
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 8 ayes.
The ayes have it and the amendment is approved. Moving on to the motion for item 3C, summer learning plans. Is there a motion to approve? With the, as amended. Let me clarify that.
This is Nick Darnell. So move.
Mr. Darnell provides the motion. Is there a second?
Second, Darrell Cobbins.
Mr. Cobbins provides the second. Any further discussion? Mr. Griffin, please call the roll.
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Mr. Darnell.
Aye.
Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson.
Aye.
Mr. Hamby.
Aye.
Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Kim. Mr. Morrow.
Aye.
Madam Chairman.
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
The ayes have it and the motion is approved. Thank you, Mr. Powers. Moving to item 3D, requirements as a result of the COVID-19 health emergency. Ms. Angie Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Angie Sanders, General Counsel for the State Board of Education. I'm presenting to you all on first and final reading an emergency rule 0520-02-03-.15 relating to issuance of permits and endorsement exemptions. Pursuant to Public Chapter 1 of the first extraordinary session of 2021, the State Board was authorized to promulgate emergency rules to implement the Tennessee Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act. This act requires the State Board to promulgate emergency rules to allow the issuance of temporary permits and endorsement exemptions for individuals to teach certain courses in order to respond to shortages and learning loss created by the COVID-19 pandemic. These emergency rules authorize the Department of Education to grant permits and endorsement exemptions to educators to teach a course with an associated end of course assessment and any other course that is specifically authorized by law. With that explanation, Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions?
Angie, this is Mike. What are the certain courses?
Great question, Mike. So the law that passed specifically mentioned courses with an associated end of course assessment because currently that is prohibited in terms of an endorsement exemption or a permit. There is a bill that is currently moving through the General Assembly that seeks to extend this through the 21-22 school year. I believe that bill is considering adding PE as a course that could receive an endorsement waiver or temporary permit, which is also a place in law that is currently prohibited. Those folks can't receive permits or endorsement exemptions. So what this language does is if that bill does pass, it would allow the Department of Education to comply with that law until we could get a permanent rule in effect. And if it doesn't, then it still implements the language that is included in the Learning Loss Act.
So we could be approving a policy both on the last item and on this one to allow a district or a school to place someone in Spanish class to teach Spanish who did not speak or read or in any to know Spanish. Is that correct?
Well, that ability already exists outside of this rule.
Yes. We've railed about this in the past. I'm just taking a great opportunity to re-rail all over again about it, but it does point out that if this whole deal is about recovery of lost education, I don't see that we're going to, it's same, you know, with any of the end of course exam courses, there's a reason why we require those to be endorsed. This is an emergency. Let me ask one more question. How is it that we correlate the, this has to be based on a teacher shortage. Otherwise, why would we be dropping our requirement? How has the emergency brought on by COVID reduced their availability of qualified teachers?
That's a great question, Mike. So I'll answer with regard to temporary permits, and then I may defer to Jack Powers to see if he can give you all a little bit more information on the department's process. But our rule on temporary permits does require that districts have to certify that they can't find a qualified teacher to fill that position. So there is and they also have to show a recruitment plan, basically tell the department, not only can't they find someone who's qualified, but tell the department how are they recruiting someone to fill that position moving forward. Jack, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that.
You described our process in terms of like requirements for a district to select a permit or a waiver. Mr. Edwards, could you restate your question?
Well, how are we correlating? We're doing this obviously because we're having to compensate for a shortage in teachers. When it's not clear to me how we're correlating the shortage of teachers to a COVID pandemic, because what we're saying we're doing now in asking people to certify they looked and they couldn't find the teacher that existed before COVID. That's been our standard deal. You gotta, and then we've got the remedy of allowing a district to place a teacher in a classroom that they're not endorsed in, as long as it's not an end of course exam there, and for a year with a possibility of an extension of another year, which I think it's really a bad public policy, but nevertheless, I don't see how this is related to COVID. I don't understand how we have less teachers today because of COVID. And that sounds stupid, but I really don't see it.
So clarification, I'm sorry. This is new legislation that requires that we do this, correct? And clarification with the ending statements on 4 and 5, it talks about shall be valid for the period of time specified in the authorized legislation. And I thought that I read somewhere, and it may not have been here, but I think, because I think I actually went to the TCA, that it's June 30th, I believe, valid till June 30th after issuance. Now, I don't see reference to beginning dates or ending dates here. So would that help clarify? It's effective immediately, but did you say that this could be continued with an extension? Did I hear you say that, or I heard Mike say it for sure?
So Madam
Oh.
Chair, oh, go ahead, Mike.
What I was just saying is that prior to this, forever in our policy and rules, an LEA who's been unsuccessful in finding a DORS teacher for a subject can place another teacher in that course as long as it doesn't have an end of course exam to it.
Right.
For up to a year, and then they can apply for an extension for another year.
Okay, so that's what you said. And so to gain clarity on this particular item, it was effective with the passing of the legislation. Is that not normally the way it goes anyway? Could you clarify that? And then secondly, the end period for this, it's a rule. It doesn't say, is it a rule?
Emergency rule.
Yes, it's an emergency rule.
Okay. So does it end this year, June 2021, or does it continue through this calendar year or indefinitely? What's the period of time? Because that's unclear to me.
Great question, Madam Chair. So we are implementing the provision of the Learning Loss Act that passed in special session. That act required that the State Board of Education pass rules to allow this. It specifically stated that these permits and endorsement exemptions are only good for the period of time that the emergency rules are in effect. By law, emergency rules are only effective for 180 days. If the additional legislation that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation does not pass to extend this through the 2021-22 school year, then these permits and endorsement exemptions would only be good for 180 days. If that law does pass, then they would be able to be good through the end of the 21-22 school year, just as any other endorsement, exemption, or permit is, by your statement, Madam Chair, normally good through June 30th.
That does have to clarify. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Easy.
So I've got a couple of comments and questions also for Angie. So where does that legislation, or maybe this is for Nathan, stand right now? And if we wanted to be sure that our position was heard on that, or at least, I don't know what the board's position is, but I agree with what Mr. Edwards is talking about with regard to not extending that for another year, or saying that it will not be extended 1 year beyond or something like that. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about getting our position heard on that? Or is it too late? And then the second point was, as you mentioned, I think that you said that they're looking at doing that for PE, and we just passed the Tom Cronin Act because Tennessee is #1 in the nation in childhood obesity, and we said that we weren't going to allow that to go for another year. We were giving them 1 year to get their PE teachers. So, I mean, what are we doing here?
So the bill itself, the Senate Education Committee, first of all, is now closed. We had about a 6-hour meeting. A couple of my colleagues on here were there with me as well. And the bill that she's referring to did have some other things that were put onto it, and then we'll have to see what happens on the House side. In terms of the Tom Cronin Act, I know that the House sponsor, yeah, it's on the House floor tonight. So the House sponsor, I know, did get together with the Speaker of the Senate to address that concern, because we always know Governor McNally is a tremendous advocate for all things in the Tom Cronin Act. The assurances that I've been given, and Charlie, you can certainly speak up if you've heard anything else, but everything I've heard, every conversation that I've heard about this is that it would be strictly for next year. When you point out that a General Assembly seems to disagree with the previous General Assembly, I mean, the best I can tell you is that definitely happens quite a bit. You know, there's kind of an overarching understanding that no one General Assembly has the authority to bind the hands of a future General Assembly. So the law, as we know it in terms of the Tom Cronin Act, yes, that expresses a great deal of understanding and work and a push to where it is. But every 2 years you get a new General Assembly, and every 2 years their priorities take precedence over what the previous General Assemblies. In terms of conversation, you know, with House members and so on, if the individual members of the board want to reach out to their individual legislators and do that, I think that's probably the best way, short of, you know, some official action that the board was to take to instruct me to attempt to work on it differently. I will say that in the conversations I've had, we've had, you know, made it very clear that these standards exist for a reason. And generally the response to that was, you know, well, we're only talking about for this one additional year. So.
Would it be helpful for the board to have a resolution?
At this point, it'd probably be a little late. You know, just probably, you could certainly do it. It's, you could, you know, there's nothing stopping the board from passing a resolution that gives the sense of their position. But ultimately, you know, the task that we're given under the law is to take what they pass and make it the best it can be to execute the vision that they have in creating the law. But I think in terms of means of petitioning or making that voice heard, you know, the passage of a resolution, individual letters, the phone calls, all those ways of going about it are certainly in order. It's just a matter of the board deciding that that's the thing that they want to do.
Thanks.
You know, in our previous votes, we know where we stand as a board, and those actions speak for the entire board. And so, you know, I agree with Nathan in that individual members would certainly, you have the option to reach out. My personal opinion in many of these things is, first of all, we're in an emergency situation still. Before I would ever go counter to what legislation is saying, I would, and we wouldn't anyway, but I mean to put my personal position out there, I would want more information. I don't know the daily struggles during the pandemic that school districts are having. We know in any given day or year, they're struggling to find the qualified teachers. So in a short-term temporary situation, this is an emergency. But I would want more information to say that I would reach out to my legislature, any of the chairmen or members of the committees. That's my personal opinion. I'm not trying to sway you all, but that's where my head is. And I don't want to put any educators on the spot. But I'm really interested to know any of you who are with the department, our own team members, evidential information that you have that would help the board think about this. And it doesn't have to be on this call, in this meeting. It certainly can be offline if you all want to follow up and get additional information.
Before you get that information, let me say one thing. I don't disagree with what you're saying, Chairwoman Hargrove. for some reason, we're still not getting to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is shortage of teachers, shortage of quality teachers, getting, and I know that we're trying to work hard to get back into the pipeline early. We really have got to figure out what it is and work with the legislature and work with the EPPs and get people, into teaching like Nick Darnell, flood the EPPs with people like Nick Darnell. We got to figure out a way to make that happen. And just talking about it, unfortunately, doesn't do anything. And so that's the root of this whole issue.
It's been an ongoing conversation. We know it's not a new conversation today, and there are partnerships that are being formed. We've heard directly from some of the EPPs, at least I know I have. The commissioner has shared with us some of the activities that are taking place, and none of it is going to happen fast enough. That's the challenge when you already are with a severe shortage. To make up that loss is not going to happen overnight, and so we do need to know perhaps some more definitive plans for, again, collecting the information in the middle of a pandemic and during a state of emergency is a little bit more challenging than normal times, because it's like, what are all of the individual directors of schools doing? And just getting your arms around all that that's an activity that will take some time. I don't disagree with you, because it's one of my I shouldn't say swan songs, that's the wrong terminology, but one of the things that I know we all care deeply and passionately about. And so for today, we have a rule before us. It is an emergency, and you have to decide, do you have any other comments that you want to make? Or are there any amendments that you want to make? And anything that we can say or do that does not go against the legislation?
Madam Chair,
It's Mr. James.
yeah, so I do want members to understand that, there are any number of actions that individual members can propose for the body in terms of weighing in on those things. You all have tremendous relationships with your local delegations and with legislators across the state. You certainly do. And, the law passes and it puts you all in a place that you feel uncomfortable with. The other side of it is it's perfectly in order to pass a resolution at a later point in time declaring the board's commitment to high standards. All of the things that are most important, if you could channel some of the speeches that have been given, every bit of that is laudable, and every bit of that could be brought up as a sense of the body resolution. It's not something that we've done a whole lot of, but there are a number of actions that can be taken to say, okay, we understand this is a one-year thing. We urge the General Assembly to keep it a one-year thing, or statements like that. There are places to go.
Thank you, Nathan. Any other questions or comments? Is there a motion to approve item 3D?
So moved.
Mr. Cobbins provides the motion. Is there a second?
Ms. Gordon, I'll second.
Mr. Ferguson provides the second. Any further discussion? Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell,
Aye.
Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards, Mr. Edwards,
Pass.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Ms. Kim, Mr. Morrow,
Aye.
Madam Chairman,
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 8 ayes.
The ayes have it and the motion is approved. Thank
Madam
you.
Chair, before we move on, I would like to at least offer to Nathan to work with him and maybe Mike and others on a resolution that Nathan talked about that at least states about, you know, something about our commitment, continued commitment to high standards, and that you know, we recognize emergency rule, emergency, but that being said, we really want to get back to, to where we can get to.
Thank you for that offer. Appreciate it. Okay. Moving on to the last item on the agenda, item 3E, textbook and instructional waiver request for Clinton City Schools. Ms. Amy Owen.
Yes, ma'am. Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research for the State Board. As you know, for about the last almost year, the State Board has had the authority to review waiver applications from districts that wish to use textbooks or instructional materials that are not approved by the State Textbook Commission and on the state approved list that goes through the board. This is due to unique or unusual circumstances of the district. In this case, we received a waiver application from Clinton City Schools for 3rd grade English Language Arts to use a program called Into Reading from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. They're seeking approval to use this textbook until the next ELA adoption cycle in 2025 through 2026. I will say in 2019, the State Textbook and Instructional Materials Commission approved the use of HMH's Into Reading textbooks for all elementary grades with the exception of 3rd grade. The review process was that the Textbook Commission conducted a thorough review of all proposed ELA materials in 2019. Based on that review, 2 specific areas of concern were identified for the 3rd grade Into Reading textbook. As part of this waiver request, Clinton City provided the board's staff with their plan to address both areas of concern identified by the Textbook Commission, and our staff who have background and experience with English language arts and with elementary instruction reviewed that waiver request to determine whether the district adequately addressed the concerns. I want to point out this is a little bit different from the textbook waiver request we reviewed at our last board meeting, where the materials in question had not been through the State Textbook Commission. In that case, our standard of review was looking for alignment to the Tennessee academic standards for those materials. In this case, the Textbook Commission has already done that work. So our standard of review here was to look at the areas of deficiency identified by the Textbook Commission and whether the district's plan would adequately remedy those concerns. The 2 areas of concern were about vocabulary and end-of-unit culminating tasks. In both cases, the district identified plans for teacher professional development, teachers developing additional culminating tasks that were better aligned with the unit, and the use of research-based vocabulary supplemental materials. Based on those plans, we are recommending approval, but we do want to emphasize for the district that while the plans are being approved or recommended for approval, it is critical that the district fully implement all of its stated plans in order to address those 2 areas of deficiency. Prior to the state board assuming authority for textbook and instructional materials waivers, other LEAs had requested to use this same item from the Department of Education. 8 LEAs had made that request, and 4 of those requests were ultimately approved, and included with the cover sheet of this item is a list of those LEAs. And finally, I will say that the unique and unusual request of the district was that they had their local adoption committee review the available materials. That committee of teachers in Clinton City unanimously selected this Into Reading program, and they believe that it best supports their plan for differentiation for students. So based on all those factors in our review of the district's plan to address the stated deficiencies from the Textbook Commission, the staff do recommend approval of this instructional materials waiver request.
Ms. Owen, you did indicate that there were 8 books that were 8 districts that previously requested approval to use this very same textbook. 4 were approved and 4 were denied. Do we have any information that helps us understand why 4 would have been denied? based on the information you've shared today. That would be helpful.
Sure. I would ask either Jack Powers or Charlie Bufalino from the department to chime in on the department's standard of review for these items in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack Powers at the Department of Education. So, Madam Chair, you know, historically, when the department has kind of evaluated these requests, I mean, what we've done is kind of compared how, or we've looked at the evidence that the school district has provided for how they will continue to meet Tennessee state standards through supplemental, you know, through supplementing, you know, additional curricular resources. And so, because we evaluate kind of their applications and what they're submitting to us kind of on a case by case basis, that is why you kind of see that there isn't like a blanket approval. It really just kind of depends on the evidence that the school district submits that they can continue to meet Tennessee state standards while using a textbook or instructional material that's not on the approved list.
I would also, Madam Chair, if you allow me, I would just add a few additional detail there. I think with this particular one, we also try to offer technical assistance and feedback to districts. So in some cases, we had districts who provided a waiver application that was deemed to be deficient. And namely, really the only thing we're looking at is the same thing that Ms. Owens just described, which is, does the district have a plan to supplement those deficiencies that were laid out by the textbook commission? That was really the standard by which we reviewed to make sure the district met. And in certain cases, we got sometimes very lengthy applications that were more of a justification of why this material should have been approved in the first place. But unless that there was that supplemental evidence of how the district would meet those deficiencies, that wasn't something we felt we could approve at the time. In several of those instances, we worked with districts who were approved on a re-review after a resubmission. So just wanted to share that additional information with you.
I did note that I think there were 2 that resubmitted and were subsequently approved. Thank you for that additional information, and Jack, thank you. It does help to understand why the 4 versus the other 4. That's clear in my mind, so thank you for that. Any other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, this is Mike Edwards.
Yes, Mr. Edwards.
Yes, out of curiosity, do we have a sense of why 8 districts thought these materials were preferred over the ones that are approved, have been approved?
Mr. Edwards, I don't have a strong sense of why the district chose to do that. I mean, I think the waiver process has been set out to provide as much district flexibility as possible. I think it could be a myriad of reasons, and I'm not sure for these individual districts specifically, but I think what's critical is what Ms. Owens said, that if the board is going to consider approval of something not on that textbook list, that there's a very solid plan to ensure that all of our relevant state standards are being met by instructional materials that districts choose to use.
And Mr. Edwards, one possible reason, Clinton City Schools stated that they had previously used a product from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt called Journeys, and I think that they may have been familiar with some of the structure of the materials, or just kind of frankly been used to using that sort of thing. So that may have been, I can't extrapolate for the other districts, but that may have been a similar reasoning.
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
I know that I think last year we put in our policy, one thing we were going to do is look at the history of waiver requests from particular districts. If we had a lot of requests from one district or another, we would think about it twice. Now, I know the Clinton City School District and it's a very high performing district, so I have no concern here, but I just want to again go on record and remind our waiver reviewers that, you know, that is a factor to be considered.
Yes, sir. Since our staff has assumed authority for this, we've developed a tracker spreadsheet so that we can keep record of every waiver request that comes to the board and what action you take on it, so that we'll be able to cross-reference that easily in the future.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve item 3E?
Bob Eby moves for approval.
Mr. Eby provides the motion. Is there a second?
Second, Darrell Cobbins.
Mr. Cobbins provides the second. Further discussion. Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins,
Aye.
Mr. Darnell, Mr. Darnell, Mr. Eby,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards,
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Mr. Hamby,
Aye.
Mr. Jensen,
Aye.
Ms. Kim, Nate Morrow, Mr. Morrow,
Aye.
Madam Chairman,
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 8 ayes.
The ayes have it and the motion is approved. Thank you again for the presentations. I do want to open up the floor to our board members and the commissioner and Director Morrison to see if there are any other comments that you all wish to make before we adjourn.
Madam Chair, this is Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
I just wanted to say that on Saturday, May the 8th, from 9 to 11, I'll be attending the middle college graduation at Rome State. And look, anyone else who wants to come, I think they got like 70 students who are going to get their 2-year degree a couple of weeks before they get their high school diploma. So I think that's a great accomplishment.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
this is Casey.
Yes.
For the record, I've already talked offline with Mr. Larry Jensen, but for the amendment on 3A, I had not recorded a vote for him. And Mr. Jensen, would you mind telling me aye or nay for that?
Aye.
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 Okay, so we have it now on the record. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Griffin, did you mean 3C? 3A did not have an amendment that I'm aware of.
I meant 3C. Thank
Thank you.
Any other, go ahead. Other comments from board members, Commissioner Schwinn? Okay, once again, as always, I think it's incumbent upon the chairman to thank all of the presenters, our TDOE partners. We could not do it without you. And of course, the due diligence of our team members who work closely with yours in the department to make all of our meetings happen. And I do not always do my part in thanking everyone because it does take a lot of work, even to do a special call meeting just as much as it is to do an in-person meeting. So thank you so much. And saying in person, we are on the path to having our next quarterly board meeting in person on May the 21st in Nashville, barring any unforeseen circumstances. And we always look to board member Gordon Ferguson to help us understand the lay of the land and safety and other issues that could be of a concern. But at this point in time, we are planning to meet in person. So thank you all so much. And without objection, we are adjourned. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.